Well, first off, thank you so much for inviting me. I've been around for a long time, just like a few of the other gray hairs, no hairs, and hair colors from a bottle in this room. And engineering has changed a lot, and I thought what I'd like to reflect upon is to talk about where I think engineering has come from and where it's going. And I'm glad you didn't ask me to talk about innovation, because if you had, Vince Cerf would have given about 90% of my talk. If I think about how innovation was done at the Skunk Works, many of the things that we did there in the area of aircraft and weapons are exactly the kinds of things that sparked Google. And maybe tonight, if you're interested in the Skunk Works and how it innovated in detail and how it may have differed from Google, we can talk about it then. But now I wanted to just talk about engineering. I think a lot of people don't realize that engineering went through a major inflection point in the late 1950s. And why did that happen? Well, it happened for the same reason that many of your senior peers, people that are in my vintage, became engineers. It was called the space race. If you look at an engineer who functioned in the early 1950s and before, it was very much a handbook approach to how problems were solved. My father was a mechanical engineer. Went to school after he came back on the GI Bill after the war, and as I watched him going through his engineering career, he was very creative and very innovative in how he thought about designing things, but he always got what he had to do out of his handbooks. And I'm sure the same thing was true for many electrical engineers too at the time. But something happened after the Russians launched Sputnik. It created a grand challenge for America, the competition with the Soviets, and how would we make sure that they didn't end life the way that we all had grown to know it in the Western world. And so a couple of things happened. One was a major transition in how engineering was taught, from handbooks to a great injection of mathematics and physics and science into how engineering was taught. So if you learned to be an engineer in the 1960s or 70s or beyond, lots of calculus, differential equations, complex variables, all the things that all of us had to go through while we were students. That wasn't true in the 1940s and 50s and before then. And it also is what motivated many of us to want to become engineers in the first place. I'm old enough to remember the fact that we used to do something called duck and cover. What's duck and cover? That was the fear that there was going to be a nuclear attack from the Soviet Union, and you wouldn't be close enough to the center point of the detonation to get wiped out, but it would blow the windows in the building and kill you with flying shards of glass. So in elementary school, we were taught when there was an air raid, you got under your desk and you ducked and you covered, or you went in the hall and you did the same thing. And it permeated the entire way that people thought about how they lived. The grand challenge, defending the country against communism and the Soviet Union, may sound passé and old today, but let me tell you, when you're a 6-year-old kid and you're told to get underneath your desk and cover because there might be an attack coming, you did it. Your community would run on a period. How many people here from California? Now, I can't see hands, but I'm sure we've got some. I see a few out there. How many of you remember every year, about April, the Great Shakeout, right? The Great Shakeout in California, I spent, when I was running the Skunk Works, I lived in Southern California. The Great Shakeout was an exercise that's done, or is an exercise done every year in California to prepare communities for earthquakes. Well, back in the 1950s and 60s, we did the same thing. Communities would have air raid drills, just like in World War II. The air raid sirens would go off. It was the fire sirens in your town, set to a different frequency pattern, and you would then either, whatever your family drill was, going in a basement or whatever, you did it to get ready for an attack. And as that was happening, a lot of people were motivated to join the fray. The space race was part of that competition. And besides that, there was now the great explosion of television, right? You're a little kid and you get to watch Mercury and Apollo and the landing on the moon, and then the first flights of the shuttle and all the missions to Mars, the first ones, Voyager and the surveyor to the moon, etc. All things were very exciting and very motivating. Well, finally we get to 1989. The wall in Berlin falls. The Soviet Union is gone within about 2 years, and the world has changed. And peace and prosperity was upon us, right? And we were going to have the giant peace dividend. And that did last for maybe about 10 years. But while that happened, a lot of interest in engineering began to wane, right? In fact, you can see it in the statistics of the number of people that went into engineering. At the end of the Cold War, those numbers began to fall. Some improvements we had made, for example, in the number of women that were entering into engineering began to stagnate. at about that time. We ended the century. We were sort of in this period of stagnation. And one of the things that someone had the idea to do at the National Academy was, let's put together a gold ribbon panel and have them define the 20 greatest engineering achievements of the 20th century. And they came up with a list of 20. By the way, number one was electrification. Think how different the world was after Westinghouse and General Electric went through the battle about AC/DC and so forth, and the entire grid was put in place, not only in the US, but in many other parts of the world. It's things like air conditioning, right? Do you think we'd be sitting at Tulane for this conference if we didn't have air conditioning? We'd probably be in Denver, right? We wouldn't be here. Nuclear energy is on the list. Telecommunications is on the list. Computing is on the list. I mean, if you sat down and made up your own list of 20, my guess is 2/3 of them will be exactly the same that are on this list. Well, then the next question came along and it said, what are going to be the 20 greatest achievements of the 21st century? Well, if I knew the answer to that, I wouldn't be standing here. I'd be somewhere in an island that I owned, getting rich off of investments. You don't know what the greatest 20 advances of the 21st century are going to be. But there was a panel put together with some very, very luminary people. For example, Larry Page was on the panel. Bob Langer was on the panel. Alec Bohr from England was on the panel. About a dozen different, 8, 9 people I think were on this very panel. And rather than come up with a prediction of what the 20 greatest inventions of the engineering inventions of the 21st century would be, they came up with what they called the grand challenges. And they identified 14 grand challenges that the world has to solve by the time we get to the end of the 21st century to maintain life on the planet as we know it. Not unlike the message you heard this morning from Derek about Coca-Cola, right? How do we maintain life as we know it on the planet for those of us that already have a modern life and expand it so that more and more people, eventually all the people on the planet, can enjoy a more advanced style of life like we have today? How do you do that in a way that's sustainable? So in fact, if you go, you can Google the grand challenges of engineering. You'll see the list of 14. But once again, they're ones that I think would all be pretty obvious to you. Things like providing clean water for everyone on the planet, managing the nitrogen cycle, solving the riddle of fusion power, securing cyberspace, preventing nuclear terror, reverse engineering the brain, designing better medicines, for example. But there's a total of 14 of those. And if those 14 are solved, they need to be solved, or we're not going to make it through this century. Well, shortly after this was done, in fact, that panel was pulled together and the report was produced in 2008, so it's almost 10 years old, now not quite 8 years old. 3 individuals, Janis Yortsis, who was the dean at USC, Rick Miller, who is now the president of Olin College up in New England, and Tom Casaleas, who had been the engineering dean at Duke and is now the provost at Virginia, got together and they created something, the Grand Challenge Scholars Program. And what the Grand Challenges Scholar Program does, there are a total of 30 schools right now that have actually put this program in place. There was a letter of intent to create this program that was signed by 123 deans in the US, and that letter was given to President Obama last April of 2015. Has full support and endorsement from not only the White House, but also bipartisan support in Congress to do something about changing the way engineering is engaging the world and how engineering is solving people's problems. In fact, an interesting little sidebar here, if you ask most people what's engineering on the street, if they have any clue at all, they're likely to come back and say, oh, those are the people that build cars, or they build TVs, or maybe they make an iPhone. They miss the point that what is engineering really all about? Engineering is about solving problems for people, right? Why did you invent a car? Not just so you could invent a car. You did it so that you could move people around and give people individual mobility over times and distances that you couldn't do before. You've heard the line from Henry Ford that if you asked the guy in the street in 1900 what they wanted, they'd say a faster horse, right? And not an automobile and what that actually brings to it. But it was there to solve a problem. It's very, very important to do that. So the idea behind this program is look at where the world is going. You've talked about a lot of these things already today. We're going to a world that's global, right? It's not just small, it's global, it's globalized. It's multicultural. It's multidisciplinary. And it's not just the double E working with the material scientist now. It's working with a neuroscientist or a psychologist or a broad range of sciences. It's something that we call convergence, where all these fields are coming together and things that are happening at the interface between all those fields. It's about being able to come together with ideas and innovating things that can be supported by a viable business model. Some people call that entrepreneurship. I don't really like that word because that implies it's going to be a startup company. It doesn't have to be, right? I would say that the Skunk Works was very, very entrepreneurial, but it was within a larger company, right? So these grand challenges of engineering, this program that was put in place is attracting students. There are now several hundred students across the country that have committed to one of these Grand Challenge engineering programs. When you graduate, in addition to having your BS degree in whatever the engineering field is, you also have a certificate that says you're a Grand Challenge scholar. And that turns out to be of great appeal to companies. Furthermore, what we find, you hear we talk about the lament of the poor statistics demographically of engineering. You know, half the population is women, slightly more than, but only 18% of the undergraduates in the US in engineering are women. Right? We know what the distribution of Hispanics and African Americans is in the general population, much, much lower in engineering registrations. But if you look at the demographics of the students that have signed up for the Grand Challenges program, it matches the available demographics that are out there, which is really very, 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 very powerful. One of the important things that we want to see coming out of the Grand Challenges program is understanding what innovation really is, because you do really innovate your way to the future. And I'll tell you one Skunk Works story that really tells about how we approached innovation. That was one of the things that Vint did not say this morning. And it's actually kind of a fun story, but it's the invention of stealth, right? The first stealth airplane that we deployed was the F-117 Nighthawk. It's the one that kind of looks like a flying Darth Vader, right? Now, where did that come from? Well, first off, we all learned in basic physics that if you have a flat surface and you have a beam of light, doesn't matter whether it's visible light or not, angle of reflection, angle of incidence, angle of reflection, right? That's easy. But how do you make a shape out of it? At some point, when you want to make a shape, flat surfaces have to come together. What happens when they come together? Well, there were a lot of models that were being written to try to understand radar cross-sections of things like airplanes, and no one knew how to solve that edge problem. And two guys at the Skunk Works happened to find an article written by some Russian mathematical physicists that solved the diffraction equation for the intersection of two flat plates. And they took that and they put it into the radar cross-section code, and lo and behold, it made predictions about shapes and what kind of signatures they would have. So they built a shape that met the criteria, should have been invisible on radar, didn't fly. It was called the hapless diamond. They stuck it up on a radar pole, they put the radar beam at it, and there was no signature. The next problem was, how do you make a shape like that fly? Well, it was a bit more challenging. They went to DARPA. There was a program called Have Blue, where they built an airplane that they actually captured most of those shape characteristics. And when they did, they made an airplane that would fly, but also it too didn't have a radar signature. Then the time came to turn it into a real fighter. That became the F-117. And once again, it flew, obviously, but it had no radar, or had a very, very low radar cross-section, especially from some certain angles. And if you think about how you could do that, and we did it in 36 months. How do you do it so quickly and so effectively? Well, one of the things you learn when you try to do something in the Skunk Works style is you don't reinvent what you don't have to. So if you look at the F-117, the way we like to describe it, it was a very, very conventional airplane, but with an entirely new, innovative dust cover on top of it, right? The engines were the same that were in an F-18. The landing gears came off of an F-15. The cockpit was a hybrid of an F-16 and an F-18, for example. All that was different was the skin, the materials on the skin, the shape, obviously, and the various control algorithms to make a shape like that fly. That was really true innovation. So if we can innovate like that in that world of defense, in that competition against the Soviet Union back in the 1970s and 80s, why can't we also innovate rapidly and inexpensively to solve these 14 grand challenges that the world faces, all right? So for those of you that are still students, you might find out if, and I think there probably are a few in the audience, whether or not your school has one of these programs. If not, maybe as an alumni, you can find out whether your school has one. You can go to the web and find out what schools actually have signed the list and which ones have actually put programs in place. But part of this whole thing, I think, creates one grand challenge that I'll ask all of you to take away from this. And I'll call it a soft grand challenge. And part of that is I think we all need to do something who are in the practice of engineering to help the public understand what engineering really is. Where I started, it's about solving problems. Most people don't understand that. If you look at the statistics in the US, 4% of our undergraduate students are engineering students. That looks like a typical country in sub-Saharan Africa. Doesn't look anything like the statistic. Even Europe is in the mid-15%. Asia is 25 or 30%, depending what country that you're in. We're at 4%. And part of it is because people don't understand, they guess, oh, it's just a bunch of these nerdy people. If you think about what engineers typically look like on TV and in the movies, right? They're either complete socially inept nerds or they're evil, right? They're not out solving the world's problems, which is what, in fact, we really do. So we need to make sure that the world understands what engineering is about. It's a very noble way to make a living. At least I think we all think it is. Not that we maybe wouldn't have a bias in this room. But I think a lot of people don't really understand that it is. So one of our challenges as we do our work is to make sure that it registers with society what this is really all about. If you think about all the things you heard other people talking about today and what they're doing, all the things correlate back to solving problems that we all face in the world today. So this next inflection point, first one was this infusion of math and physics and so forth. The next inflection point is the convergence of various fields, the understanding that engineering is about solving problems, and the rise of this broad engagement, one manifestation of which is this grand challenges of engineering concept that changes the way engineering is approached. And it's very likely that over the course of the next decade, you're going to see curricula around the country begin to morph and change to capture some of those spirits that will lead to the greatest change in curricular structure in engineering since what happened in the late 1950s and early 1960s. And you'll be there in the front row to watch it all happen and assist in the transformation as it does. So with that, Guru?
Thank you so much, Al. The grand challenge seems to be a truly powerful, a fundamental concept. These are not a bunch of goals, but really it is, I think, designed to help orient our approaches toward that. Clearly, grand challenges do require very different types and kinds of innovations. But the issue is people define innovation in very different ways. I mean, there are various definitions of it. Does it really matter?
Well, I think it really does. In fact, when I told you the story of the hapless diamond, half blue, and the F-117, the way I think about those things is the understanding of the mathematics for how you could make a shape that would not be detectable by radar because it reflects things basically away from the receiver, right? That was the Russian mathematics. That was the invention. That was the creation, rather, the discovery.
I see.
Turning it into a shape that would fly, the half blue, that was the invention. But the innovation is turning it into a real product, you know? So I make the distinction that innovation is the last step of taking a collection of new technologies to market. I mean, I would argue, I don't know if there's anyone here from Apple or not, but I would argue that in a lot of ways, something like the iPhone is a classic example of true blue innovation, right? The iPhone in and of itself is based on a whole collection of creations and discoveries and inventions going back into, well, you could argue back into the 1930s, but certainly into some of the work done in strained layer superlattice compound semiconductors in the 1980s, right? So where it's decades worth of invention and discovery that led to the innovation, all of which came together to produce the iPhone, right? So innovation, in my mind, is pulling together this vast background of invention and discovery and creating a new useful product that solves problems for people.
Very good. Do you want to take a couple of questions from the audience?
Sure, maybe turn the light up so we can see who we're talking to.
And maybe while we have people line up near the microphones, let me ask this somewhat of a personal question.
Sure.
I mean, you're a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, one of very few engineers.
Right.
How do you know so much?
Well, I'm not sure I do, but one thing I will tell you is, and I think a lot of the more senior people in the room would agree with this, there's a difference between sort of being smart and having wisdom. And wisdom is really the collection of knowledge that comes together over a lifetime and being able to correlate all those pieces together. So what will happen is the experiences that I've had over an almost 40-year career, and I've had, 13 different jobs. I've done everything from running satellite programs, rocket programs, subsystems inside of nuclear weapons, silicon fabs, compound semiconductor fabs, all those pieces, right, come together. And at each one of the steps of the way, you need to learn the technology, at least the very basics of it, but then you need to understand how all the pieces come together.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I've always done is I've always really been an avid reader, and I read lots and lots of journals, and not just things related to science and engineering, but things like, Foreign Affairs, The Economist, The Atlantic Monthly. I mean, there's just tons of these things out there you can read that give you a very, very broad understanding of society and what its needs are, et cetera. And the human brain, this is going to be one of the real challenge for the AI people. The human brain has an incredible ability to take completely separate things that you would never think are correlated to one another and pull them together in a way. You'll see something in nature that will inspire the way you will end up designing something later. That's going to be hard to get a computer to capture the fact that it's seen something years before in a completely different context and be able to pull something forward and have it influence the way it designs something going forward into the future. So I think wisdom that comes with years of experience is the ability to see and retain all these things and then to integrate them into what can be a very unique way of looking at a problem or coming up with a solution.
Very good. We
Yes.
have questions.
I have a question regarding your point that we have.
Please introduce yourself.
Yeah, sure. I'm Ravinder. I'm from Seattle section. I have a question regarding, we have very few number of students in our undergrads who take engineering as a major. What do you think, what are the root causes that in US where we have such a strong schooling system? When I see the books of high school, I come from Asian, I studied in Pakistan, my high school. When I see the books over here, there's so much focus, the mathematics, the kind of questions they're doing, they're pretty good. What happens down in the college that you think that people don't take, or they drop out the undergrad?
I think this is purely my opinion now, but at least some things that I think there is sort of a myth that floats around that engineering is just flat out too hard, that the math is too hard, and I don't want to go and have to do something that's so hard. So I think that frightens a lot of people away. I think the way a lot of us learned to be an engineer, it was take calculus and learn this stuff. Take physics, 1, 2, 3, learn this stuff. You'll eventually see how it all comes together to help you be an engineer. That path and that abstraction, a lot of people get completely turned off by it and they lose interest. As opposed to saying, I'm trying to solve a problem here and I need these tools to solve that problem. So I think we're kind of in a system right now of like we push you towards engineering as opposed to what engineering does, pull you towards it. And I think maybe there just isn't the discipline here and the patience in our society to want to wait and be pushed down those multiple steps. And I think there are probably other societies that are more patient perhaps than we are, and maybe don't get as intimidated by somebody telling you it's hard as we find here. Just my opinion.
Hi, my name is Abhilash. I'm from the University of Colorado Boulder and from IEEE Denver section. You mentioned Grand Challenge, right? So my university has the Grand Challenge implemented. We work on unmanned aerial vehicles. So this is a collaboration between the university and a couple of industries. So do you think that this Grand Challenge can be integrated as a whole entirely all over the world, leveraging technical societies such as IEEE and others?
Yes, I think it does. And as a matter of fact, your new dean, Bobby Brown, from Georgia Tech, is a big fan. He's a member of the Academy and a very big fan of the Grand Challenges. So he's probably going to throw some more wood in the fire when he gets to Boulder later this summer or early this fall. No, I think it will. Of the 30 schools right now that have signed up that have implemented these programs, there's one in Singapore and one in Malaysia that have already been implemented in addition to 28 here in the US. So yes, it is a global movement. I know in the UK, for example, the UK government has just given the Royal Engineering Society funds in order to create some form of a Grand Challenges program there. India has a Grand Challenges program that they call Imprint. It's a little bit different than ours. It looks to me when I was over there last fall, it's a little bit more reminiscent of an NSF or DOE Center of Excellence kind of model than here, where they've gone to a variety of IITs, so they'll go to one and say, you're going to be the one who's going to be the steward of clean water in India. So here's your money to build research, and by the way, we want to involve other IITs and universities across India, and they've defined 10 for India. And so that program's already in place and running. The Chinese are in the process of putting a program in place. So I think their answer is yes, it will happen around the world, and I think there are real opportunities for the engineering societies, including an IEEE, which of course is, I think, the biggest in the world, to have a major impact in how these things unfold. But it clearly has become a global movement.
Hi, I'm Sana Sarfraz. I'm an engineer at Delphi Automotive and a volunteer with the Buenaventura section, Region 6. My question today, you mentioned that not to reinvent something that you already have. As an engineer faced with a new problem, how can we identify things that we can reuse? And also, what are some of the things that we should keep in mind when we develop something with the goal of having it reused by other systems?
Well, I'm not so sure. Well, see, there's a couple of things that come to mind, and there's actually, I think, that's really almost two questions. I think this is a case where wisdom and experience helps you recognize what it is, and some of it can become institutionalized. So, for example, whenever we build a new airplane at the Skunk Works, and the time came to worry about landing gears, right? Step number one, go out and find out if there was already a landing gear in existence on general, it could be on a business jet, could be in another military airplane, could be in a commercial airplane that would meet the needs. You don't have to reinvent them. It turns out landing gears are a very, very long lead item for airplanes because of typically the materials that they're made out of. So you eventually begin to put protocols in place that there are certain things that you need to look for over and over and over and over again. So, for example, if I think about Delphi, not every car has its own unique fuel injectors, right? So that's a piece that can be relatively standardized. You can reuse intake manifolds on cars. So blocks, there's lots of things that you look at. And what parts are amenable to that, I think, are ones that will come with experience in looking at it. In terms of how you can think ahead for the future, one of the real trends, and it's one where the defense industry that I came from is not particularly good at, but it's going to have to get better at, is doing things that are modular, right? So you can have a collection of modules that, depending on how you put them together and which ones you use, you can change the functionality and not build an entire system just from new. It becomes a menu of all these different things, you put them together. Modularity is an important way to make sure that you get the greatest flexibility out of what you have. It also enables you to put in upgrades along the way without replacing whole systems. And it also can potentially be a way to capitalize on a whole variety of emerging direct manufacturing technologies as well.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
Hello, my name is Daniel Hudson. I'm from Region 2, Ohio State University. My question was more about the the change in the perspective of engineering as problem solving. How do you when do you think we should change that perspective, like in high school, and whose responsibility is that to?
I think it's all of our responsibilities, and I think it's really a matter, I think, of public understanding of engineering. There are a lot of companies who have gotten this message. You'll see a lot of them. For example, one that ExxonMobil had a huge push on trying to show engineering on TV commercials, and how it was solving problems. There's one on TV right now, I think it might be Koch Industries, where their CTO is talking about they have this grand vision of providing clean drinking water for everyone on the planet. And they're highly motivated by being able to solve that. So I think it's the responsibility of companies in their advertising. I think it's the responsibility of some very senior people in terms of maybe writing op-eds. It's in terms of, for example, when we go up on the Hill and talk to Congress, we try to carry the message that has to be done. It's the way all of us just engage in conversation that, no, I'm not just a nerd with a pocket protector and a slide rule. I know that's not your generation. But you get the image, right? It's about trying to solve things for people. And there are a lot of younger people, even younger than you, that are attracted to wanting to be able to solve society's problems that don't understand that's what engineers do. So it's up to us in any way we can think of, I think, to get that message across. It's a place where I think Hollywood could be a real example. One of the things we started last year was something, how many people here have seen probably the reruns of MacGyver, right? Right, MacGyver was a guy who sort of was an engineer, although they never actually said that he was an engineer, who did all these clever things to solve crimes and solve problems, right? Well, there was an idea that came up last year. In fact, it was the original creator of MacGyver was one of the people who got the idea kicked off. We got some funding from some foundations to create something called the next MacGyver. And the whole idea was to create another potential TV series. We went through a competition scheme where there was going to be the next MacGyver, who was going to be a woman engineer who was going to solve problems using engineering. We had this competition across the country. Something like 200 people wrote very simplified forms of scripts for TV programs. They went through a narrowing down phase to 5 finalists, right? Each one of those 5 finalists was assigned an engineer. I actually did one of them, and somebody who was a screenwriter in Hollywood, that had done things like Star Trek and other things that would help them write this script. And a couple of them eventually got knocked out of the way, like mine got knocked out, sorry. But there's 3 that are still in the running, and they're actually out now taking this thing to various studios to try to, so the media can carry a real strong, lever in trying to get this message out to the public as well.
And the final question is?
Hi, my name is Sean Garrity. I'm from Region 7. I'm the Young Professionals Chair for Vancouver, BC. And I wanted to go back to where you were talking about that pivoting of skill sets when there is the big change. And as we're moving into the 21st century, what do you see as the new engineering skill set? It became math and like calculus, very heavy calculus based. Is that going to be evolving in the 21st century to be a new skill set for engineers?
Yeah, well, I see. In my view now, obviously, everyone's there are good things about experience that you've had, and also bad things, right? I happen to think that all the math and physics I had to take, it's like, well, I had to take it, so you should have to do it too, right? But I know during my career, I thought having those skills actually paid a lot of dividends. I could solve problems that maybe otherwise I would have had to try to do it in an Edisonian way that would have been very, very slow. So I don't think those needs are going to go away, but I think what we'll see happening is, the motivation is going to change, all of these grand challenges, and I think the next big thing that's happening is going to be solving these things with convergence. So one of the issues, one of the grand challenges is reverse engineering the brain. Now, if you think about that, that actually has lots of different facets to it. One of it is understanding how the brain works. And can we use that to help with mental illness or, maybe fighting Alzheimer's disease or whatever it might be? But it also might help us understand how to more quickly get to true AI, right? Because the human brain, people like to say, well, numbers of neurons, number of transistors, it must be the same. It's not the same because they don't work together the same way, right? But maybe learning how a brain works. In fact, this already is happening, but it's not as sophisticated as it could be, will help us improve better ways of doing AI, which is what's really going to be needed to really, truly make, I think, more and more of these self-driving cars or whatever else it might be. I'm not sure I believe these predictions that most vehicles on the road by 2025 are going to be self-driving. I find that a little bit hard to believe. I think fleet mixing is going to be a very, very tough problem as they come together. But so every one of these grand challenges has many, many facets to it. And I think it's going to take this convergence of, as I said, engineering, mathematics, physics, neuroscience, maybe even psychology, right? How are people going to adapt to turning this other piece of their life over to a machine? Right? So it's the convergence of these fields. I think that's going to be one of the big changes that will happen. It'll also, the days of engineering being a solo sport are long gone. Engineering is a team sport. A small team on a major engineering project is a couple hundred people. That's a small team if it's a major project. When we did things like the F-117, when that was first started, it was several hundred people to do that. That's a small team for a big integrated system. But I don't know how many people Apple used to create the first iPhone, but I guarantee it wasn't 2 guys in a lab.
Al, you're a very, very busy person. We thank you so much for spending time
Thank
with us
you.
today.